in our webinar series for researchers called From Research to Publication, a Researcher's Guide to Open Access. Welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, and also welcome if you're joining us after you joined us for the first webinar that we hosted. The webinar today is going to be covering APCs, article processing charges. So what's up with APCs and how do I deal with them? The first webinar actually in our series From Research to Publication, Why Should I Care About Open Access, which gives a great overview of the open access publishing journey, is now available to view on our events page with the accompanying slides on chronoshub.io. And we're going to have another two webinars in this series on April 21st and May 12th, and they will be covering the funders and also covering publishing agreements. Okay, so this webinar will also be recorded and be available on the events page of our website, chronoshub.io. Just as a bit of an introduction to me, I'm Laura Davidson. I am a customer care specialist at Kronos Hub. So every day I'm speaking to researchers and also speaking to institutions and funders that we work with. I also have a background in higher education. So I worked at universities in the United Kingdom for about 10 years, both as an administrator and as a lecturer. So I've been on both sides there. And that's really where my open access journey started. So I started learning a lot more about the open access publishing world when I was working at universities. I'm also currently a PhD researcher outside of my role at Kronos Hub. So I'm also a researcher as well. So I bring that kind of knowledge into the webinar. And I will be bringing questions that we get from researchers and from customer care at Kronos Hub into the webinar as we go along today. Romy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Laura. My name is Romy Beard. I've been working in scholarly communications for the last 17 years. I work for publishing companies, aggregators, as well as organizations that work with libraries and consortia and researchers, and negotiated some open access agreements that deal especially with waivers and discounts for APCs. I've run a few webinars like this on APCs and how to pay them and how you can get waivers, which are all things we're hoping to cover today.
So today we'll give you a background on what article processing charges are, and we'll review the context. We'll give you a bit of the basics of what APCs will mean to you as a researcher when you're publishing, and we'll also be covering what APC payments, like how much they are, how you pay them, when you pay them, and who pays them as well, because that will differ on the type of institution or funder that you work at. So we'll be covering all of that. We'll be giving you a brief overview of that. And then at the end, we'll also provide you with some resources to help you as well on your publishing journey. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll. We'd like to know if you have published a OA before. So have you published open access before? I'll just launch the poll now. Okay, so you should be able to see it on your screen now. Have you published articles by open access before?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
Yep, so the question is, have you published articles in open access before? With the choice of yes and no answer, just to get an idea of where the audience is coming from. We'll be kind of covering aspects for both.
Yeah.
Give us a bit of a feel.
Yeah. Okay, so I think most people maybe answered by now. So it's an interesting split. I'll just end the poll now. It's an interesting split. So we've got 23% have published open access articles before and 77% have not. So 23% yes, I've published open access before, and no is 77%. Interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'll share the results.
Oh yeah, now I can see them as well.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's actually quite similar to what we had in our first webinar. So not altogether unsurprising. So as Laura said, we're going to start with a little bit of a recap of the things we covered not last week, in the last webinar about 3 weeks ago. We talked about general definition of open access, and I summarized that as open access lifts the barrier to accessing and reading research articles. And that's really for the benefit of the reader, who then doesn't pay to need to access articles. But unfortunately, that can sometimes be at the cost of the author. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And those charges that are being addressed to the author that wishes to publish open access are called article processing charges, or short APCs. They can also be called article processing fee, open access charge. And generally, they cover things like running peer review systems, copy editing, typesetting, and hosting the article. So the work that the publisher does that would usually effectively be covered by subscription income. So when we look at publishing open access versus archiving open access, which is what we talked about last time as well in quite a lot of detail, and I think that's really important to understand. With publishing open access, it's the author that makes the choice to publish. The final PDF is made instantly available on the platform. There's no delay. There's no action as such required from the author, although it's the author's choice. But as I mentioned, often this comes at a cost to the author. And the other option is archiving, where the author needs to put usually the article accepted version of the manuscript into an institutional repository. Sometimes there's an embargo, sometimes there's no license applied. But the benefit of this is that there is generally no cost to the author in going this open access route. So this is just something to remember in all this as well. When we talk about options, archiving is still an option. If you don't have the funds to publish open access, you can consider archiving your article at no cost. We did talk as well already about different types of open access, and I just want to drill down a little bit more into this in the context of APCs. We talked about hybrid open access, which is open access publishing in a hybrid journal. And a hybrid journal is a journal that contains both open and closed articles. And here is really where most of the APC costs come from. If you publish open access, an APC cost will apply. And then we have gold open access, which is open access publishing in a fully open access journal or a gold journal. And those journals only include open access articles. And some gold journals charge APCs, but others don't. We've got an example later about 13,000 that are listed in DOAJ that don't charge APCs. Variations of that include bronze, which we can't really call publishing open access because bronze is really an initiative from a publisher who decides to open up access to an article for a period of time. So it could be, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, so medical publishers opened up access to journals for 6 months or 12 months, and perhaps afterwards closed them again, or they didn't. But if they left it open during the period it was open, there was certainly no APC for the author, but also no license. So it's not actively publishing in open access. Another kind of subset of that is diamond or platinum, which is open access publishing with no fee applied, generally because the costs are covered by other initiatives, such as volunteering, donations, subsidies or grants, or if it's published by an organization that has income coming from another area, perhaps they do trainings or other things for their members. And then the other type of open access is green archiving that I talked about, where you can put the AAM in an institutional repository. And again, in the context of APCs, no costs apply to this. In general, I know of one exception, but in general.
Okay, so we have a question that we often get asked in customer care. And the question is gold open access, so gold open access journal without an APC, the same as diamond open access?
Yes, you can say that gold without APC is the same as diamond or platinum. It's really a subset of gold without the APC.
Yeah.
And just another recap here about publishing open access, which usually has fees for you, whereas closed access, where the subscription is covered. And as I mentioned earlier, in a way, the APC is a way to make up for the subscription cost. But also bear in mind, there's over 12,000 articles, journals that don't charge APCs. So it's not always black and white, unfortunately.
And another question from customer care that we often get asked, so do publishers get money for subscriptions and APCs from hybrid journals?
Yes, they do. That's a really interesting question, and I think we touched on that briefly on our first webinar. Indeed, for hybrid journals, publishers do get money from subscriptions to libraries to access the closed content, but also they have revenue from authors that publish open access and pay APCs. And this is referred to generally as double dipping. Now, I can't remember when these first agreements started, but generally when open access increased and more APCs were being paid to hybrid journals, really with the advent of hybrid journals, institutions noticed that they were paying for subscriptions and probably also within the institution paying for APCs. So what they did is they started to make agreements with publishers called offsetting agreements. And in that case, the publisher would give that institution that subscribes some vouchers or tokens that their authors could use for open access publishing. And this has really evolved now into very popular read and publish agreements, or publish and read agreements. They're also called transformative or transitional. And the idea of those agreements is to bring the subscription spend and the APC spend under one agreement and control that. So it's not completely out of control and institutions don't know what they're paying in APCs to the same publisher. So the idea is to combine the two, and more attention is being paid to what is called APCs in the wild. So institutions can track APC spend if it flows through their finance system, but if authors pay for APCs out of their own pocket, they can't really track that very well. So a lot of efforts be made to make sure that any tracking is happening, so you get a full oversight. And those agreements really mean that as well, because then everything is brought under one agreement to avoid that. The other thing to mention here is that, publishers are very aware that institutions are looking at that and aware of the double dipping, and most publishers have a no double dipping policy nowadays, where they actually state how the increase in open access is progressing, and in some cases the subscription pricing decreasing because of this. So they are tracking that internally and are quite aware of it, and it's something that you can always ask about. What we'd also like to clarify is the difference between APCs and editorial acceptance decision. So in publishing, when you submit your article, the peer review is always a blind peer review, and the person who decides whether your article will even go to a peer reviewer, or even the peer reviewers that look at it, they don't know whether the article will be published open access or not. They don't know if you're going to or intend to or committed to paying an APC, or if it will be closed access and it gets put in a subscription pot. So the two have really nothing to do with each other, generally speaking. One is managed by editorial and the other one by finance. So it's different teams at publishing companies. And for that reason as well, just because you pay an APC doesn't mean that you will get published. It doesn't guarantee publication just because you pay a fee, but generally you pay it after acceptance anyway, but you would commit to it, you would know about it early on. So in terms of the timing of when APCs are paid, generally this is after acceptance of the article, and some publishers actually wait with publication until the APC is paid. But others don't. Others go ahead and publish anyway, and they trust that the authors will pay, and in their case, most of them do. And what some hybrid journals do, or publishers with hybrid journals, is that they would publish the article, but they keep it in closed access until the APC is paid. So once the APC is paid, they would make it open access. Now, bearing in mind that you would be told at acceptance what the APC is, and that's when you would get the invoice. And usually there's a window of let's say 4 to 8 weeks at least until the article is published. So that should be plenty of time to get the APC paid. But I understand in some cases it might not be. And this could potentially cause some issues with funder policy violation. For example, if your funder says that your article must be published immediately open access, and there's a delay in paying the invoice, and it doesn't get published open access straight away, But I think that's doesn't happen very often, I would say. Do you have anything else to add about that, Laura?
Not at the moment. I think I have something to add about this a little bit later. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, then. Other article fees, other per article costs that you might encounter that aren't called article processing fees. And just to draw the attention to this and make a distinction between those fees and article processing charges with cover open access and publication costs. You might encounter submission fees, which some publishers charge at the point of submission, which can be a reason to, make up for the time they spend on reviewing articles. If they get a really high submission rate, every article needs to be read and considered. So by introducing a fee, naturally you will receive less submissions, but also you might, hope to receive better quality submission and have a higher acceptance rate. So that's the reason why some publishing is introduced that. You might also encounter color charges, which is really historically coming from the print side, when it cost money to print something in color. If you have pictures, if you have charts, images. I think nowadays some people think that's really a bit outdated to have color charges, especially if it's all digital. So I think that's happening less. You also might encounter editorial charges or page charges. For example, if you submit a really, really long article, obviously it takes longer to edit, it takes longer for peer reviewers to read it. So there might be surcharges for that. There might also be supplementary charges to cover any additional materials you're submitting, or invoice charges. If you don't pay an invoice by credit card, for example, but you want to pay by invoice, that there can be surcharge simply because it can take longer for the transfer to happen, for it to get to the right person, whereas the credit card is pretty instant. And obviously, like most publishers would prefer that.
So this is a question that we had in customer support recently. And a researcher asked, a publisher has offered me the chance to submit my article as guided open access, and I need to pay before the article is accepted. What does this mean? So if we go to the next slide, some publishers offer this new route called guided OA, and it essentially means that you can submit your article to be considered by maybe a group of open access journals. So it could be that there's one fully open access journal and two of them are hybrid. So that's the different journal types that they offer. And they're just trying to offer an open access publishing route. And in this scheme, you pay a charge when you submit, which is an editorial charge. In some cases, that will be the way that it's described. And then after the article is accepted in one of the journals that's included in the offer that they give you, you'll also be invoiced for a top-up article processing charge, a top-up APC. I think the thing to bear in mind, if you are offered this by a publisher, just to check with your funder or whoever will be paying the APC if it is actually in line with their guidelines, because they may pay the top-up APC, but they might not pay the editorial charge at the same time. And so that's something to be aware of. And also just to check that the journal types are that they are compliant with what your funders' wishes are in terms of their open access policy. Yeah. So that's an extra thing on top of what you might be charged on an invoice that you receive from a publisher. So as you were talking about, like the color charges, the editorial charge, maybe an administration fee, if you go through a route like guided open access, it's likely that the invoices will be split, so you'll be charged and when you submit the article, but then also it's likely that you'll be charged the top-up APC fee at the end. So that's just another thing to bear in mind when you are going through the publishing journey and you have your article accepted or you're submitting your article. Just make sure you check what all the details are before you start.
Yeah, I think this could be tricky if your funder has restrictions. For example, if they say, I only pay strict APCs, I don't pay editorial charges, or I only pay if the article is published in a fully open access journal, and in this case, only one of them is fully open access. and you don't know where it'll go. It'll be interesting to see how this pans out.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just something to be aware of, really. Yeah.
So when we talk about additional charges and things that we wanted to bring up, not to confuse with APCs, really, it's quite hard not to talk about predatory publishing. We had questions about this in the first webinar that we wanted to unpick a little bit. And I read one interesting article that talked about predatory publishing as an unintended consequence of open access, which I thought was quite interesting, because clearly with open access rising and them seeing you can charge for APCs to publish, saw that as a business venture. But predatory publishing is really a kind of fake publishing. So there's no quality check. There's no, usually the editorial teams don't actually exist. There's no proofreading, there's no peer review. So the quality is not what it should be, and it will actually, as a researcher, damage your reputation. There are some lists out there, like Cabell's and Beale's, that like kind of have a list of predatory journals. But one article I found was talking about, analyzing all these lists and looked at the overlap. And as you can see here, some journals were deemed legitimate by the DOAJ, which we consider like a really good source. But Beale's and Cabell's listed them as predatory. So I think you need to use your own judgment as well when you submit, and always do a quality check. For example, if you've been asked to pay to get published quicker, that indicates, in my head, that would ring alarm bells. And again, this is not the same as a genuine APC fee. Other things you can do is check that the staff are actually working. They are, like the team, the editorial board, look at where they're supposed to work, look at that website. And a good source for this is also Think, Check, Submit, which takes you through all the steps you might be taking. And then let's get back into what we're here to talk about, really, not what aren't APCs, but what are APCs and how much do they cost, which is really like the elephant in the room, isn't it? How much should I pay? As we mentioned, some journals don't charge anything. There's a lot of studies out there that show that what is actually being charged is less than what is out there advertised as list price, because sometimes authors get members, get membership discounts because they're editors, they get vouchers for reduction of the fee, or because they perhaps ask for a discount, they say, I can't quite afford to pay this. So the project Open APC is documenting what is actually being paid in APC, and I think it's quite an interesting one to look at in comparison to the list prices, and also the distinction between APCs for fully open access, gold journals, and hybrid journals. So here's an example of, like, if you drill down into the big open APC tree, you can see for Elsevier, for example, the mean value of an APC is 2,600 euros, and for Springer is 1,900. And you can put a filter on this to show how much is it for hybrid only or for gold only, and you would generally see that it's lower for gold journals than for hybrid journals with those big names, those big publishers. And that can be often because fully open access journals are newer journals, and nowadays some journals flip from hybrid to gold, so they already have things like an established readership and established authorship impact factor. But if it's a new journal, they often don't have that, so they would make the pricing lower. But it's really high impact factor, high, metric journals, can always charge higher APCs because, they is the quality that kind of demands that in some way, I guess. But this can give you an indication as well as list prices. But the answer really to how much it costs is that it's all over the place, and you can find some that are really low, like especially like university press initiatives that try and keep the pricing really low, and it could be like 200-300 euros, and others can be as high as 5,000. In terms of who pays the APC, they can be covered by research funders through research grants. They can also be covered by institutions that have budgets to pay for it on behalf of their authors, or it could be authors paying out of their own pocket or out of their research fund. And we'll talk in more detail as that in the next webinar about that as well. And what's happening increasingly, we talked earlier a little bit about transitional agreements, read and publish agreements. So these agreements cover APC fees, in which case authors don't actually have to pay if they recognize properly through the workflow. So that's happening more and more as well, that there's not actually an APC charge. We'll talk about that in more detail. The other thing we wanted to add here, Laura was telling me a lot of questions, a lot of from researchers to customer care, think that Kronos Hub pays APCs. We don't, we're not a funder as such. What we do is we manage the funds on behalf of some funders and some institutions. So we do kind of technically the person that pays, but the money doesn't come from Kronos Hub, but from our partners.
Yeah, exactly. We're in the middle. We're helping the funder and the researcher pay for the APC, but the actual money comes from the funder. Yeah, they're the person, they are the people that are paying. Okay, so we've got our second poll of the webinar. Just get it up on your screens. So this is going to be really interesting. So if you haven't published OA, why not? I'll just launch that now. Hopefully you can see it on your screens.
Yeah, so the question is, for those that are watching this, because in the recording you'll be able to see it, if you haven't published OA, why not? The options are the journal I want to publish in doesn't have an OA option, the APC costs are too high, or other.
I'll just give everyone a little bit more time to answer. You can see the results are still coming in. Okay, so I will end the poll now and share the results with you all.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting.
You want to read that out, Laura?
Yes, so the journal I want to publish in doesn't have an OA option, so that's 9%. APC costs are too high, that's 45%, so that's interesting. And then also other, which is 45%. So that's really interesting. So I think it's interesting from the start, the majority of you had not published OA, and then to see that 45% that could be as a result of APC costs being too high. That's an interesting result. And also, I think it's just coming up how we're going to talk about different ways that you can maybe avoid paying APCs or reducing the cost of APCs as well. We'll go through that a little bit soon. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that now.
Thanks, Laura.
You're welcome. So, perfect question for now. So a frequently asked question from our customer support is, I don't have the budget to pay for an APC. What options do I have? So there's various different ways.
Yeah, so I think we mentioned that a few times now. Some journals don't actually pay for APCs. So if you go to the DOAJ, there's over 12,000. If you click on that tile with the number, you can search through those journals. So that would be a way to publish open access without an APC. And those journals are, quality checked. There's quite rigorous controls that DOAJ has. You have to fulfill certain criteria to be listed in the DOAJ. So you shouldn't have to worry about things like predatory publishing. So that could be a starting point if you don't have any money. The other thing is, if you come from a low income or middle income countries, a lot of publishers provide waivers or discounts depending on where you are based, or perhaps one of your co-authors is based. As long as it's the corresponding author, you could apply for those. In some cases, they're triggered automatically. In other cases, you actually have to apply at submission. So it's something to bear in mind. And you can find information on that on the different publishers' websites. Unfortunately, there's no unified place to search for that. Then if you're an editor to a journal, you usually would get a discount. If you're part of a society, if you have a membership, you would get a discount through that. And then the other thing, authors can generally, for some publishers, you could apply for a waiver or have a conversation if you really don't have any funds to pay for it for yourself. Some publishers have a rigorous process. You have to fulfill certain criteria. So those are all things that you can do individually as an author. And the other thing is indeed depends on your institution, on which institution you're affiliated with. Perhaps you're affiliated with multiple institutions. Perhaps you have co-authors. So it's worth checking all the affiliations of all the co-authors to see who might trigger an agreement and could be the corresponding author, or could be moved to become the corresponding author if it means not having to pay for an APC. So those are things like institutional membership, which is also an agreement between that institution and a publisher that would trigger a discount or a complete waiver, i.e. the fee is covered through an agreement. So that's something to bear in mind and to think about and look at, and might need to do a bit of research. And as I said, that's usually triggered at submission. So it's always good to try and look into that in advance before you submit.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's kind of interesting this week in customer care, actually, we received an invoice for an APC from a smaller publisher, and they actually, they have a fund that they put aside for authors who do not have access to APC funding, which is something, yeah, like you said, it's really important to ask or find out if you are entitled to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, usually that is something that you might want to direct to the finance team at a publisher, or send it to the editorial team and they pass it on. But I think it's, something to look at people's policies, and usually there's information about that on publishers' websites.
Yeah.
I've mentioned the term corresponding author. Most of you are probably familiar with that, but in case you're not, most papers you have more than one author, but the corresponding author is the author who generally would submit the article, who organizes the co-authors perhaps, who receives then email updates from the publisher during the peer review process, who'd also get the decision from the publisher, and is the author who pays the APC, or who might trigger the waiver or discount or the agreement recognition. So that's why if perhaps there's a choice of who's going to be the corresponding author, you might want to look at, who might trigger the best conditions through their institution or through themselves as society membership or other type of memberships that could bring you a discount on the APC. Before we move on to this next poll, I just wanted to say, for the people that answered other to our first poll, if there are other reasons why you didn't publish open access, we'd lovely to hear from you. So please feel free to put that in the chat. Perhaps it's something we can discuss at the end.
Okay, so we'll get the third poll going. Let's get up now. So if you have published open access, how was your APC funded? We'll launch the poll now. So if you have published open access, how is your APC funded? So I've not published open access. My funder paid the APC. My institution paid the APC. I paid for it myself. My APC was waived, covered by an agreement, or other. So those are the options. And just wait for some more answers to come through. So either I've not published open access, my funder paid the APC, my institution paid the APC, I paid for it myself, the APC was waived, covered by an agreement, or other. Just give it another couple of seconds. And then we can see the results.
So we had about a third at the start who had said that they had published open access. So I guess the percentages here might be quite small.
Yeah. Yeah. So the largest one, 80%, I have not published open access of people who answered. 10%, my funder paid the APC, which is interesting. 0%, my institution paid the APC. I paid for it myself, 0% as well. And then my APC was waived or covered by an agreement is 10%. And then other is 0. So that's interesting that some of you have already used a waiver in the way that Romy was describing. Okay, I will just stop sharing now. Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
And that leads us onto the last part of the webinar, into how APCs are paid, directly covered by funding bodies like institutions or funders. or paid for by authors, but reimbursed by funding bodies. So here we're getting a little bit more into not actually who has the money, but the technicality of it on how it's being paid. So as an author, for example, when you get your acceptance email and you redirect it to a place where you should pay for the APC, usually you have the chance to put down a credit card, and maybe you could use an institutional card, partner card, or you could request an invoice. And a lot of systems, you can also have an invoice redirected to your institution. So you're not liable for it yourself, because you know my institution will pay for it. So here's an example from the Kronos interface, where you can tick a box. You can leave it ticked that says my invoice address is the same as my actual address, or you can open it up and then you can put a different address in for where the invoice should be sent. We mentioned also APC payments by credit card, in some cases checks, but I think credit card and invoice tend to be the most common ways of doing this. But then they can also be paid directly, immediately, without you having to do anything, such as even referring it. And some funders do that. And we've got an example here with a funder that Kronos Hub works with, the SNSF. So if you do your submissions as an author through the Kronos Hub platform, we know that you're a grantee. We know that you're being covered if you meet certain conditions, and then the invoice is being paid for directly. And there's other examples of other funders that do this either directly, like FNR, FWF, or through block grants like UKI and Welcome. And we'll dig more into this in our next webinar in April, but there are also some restrictions. And in the case of FNR, SNSF, the Swiss National Funder, it can be a maximum. They only pay an APC for up to a certain amount, or they only pay APCs for gold journals, as we can see on the right-hand sides here. For gold, they would pay. For hybrid, they won't pay, or it can be a max fee. It can also be, in some cases, restricted to article type. The other restrictions that we missed out, Laura?
License. So some funders will only fund articles that have a specific license. For example, a CC BY, which is the most open access license you can have. I know that, I think it's the Gates Foundation, I think that they use CC BY as a compliancy thing, as an eligibility for funding for paying the APC, and also FNR as well. They stipulate that you must have a CC BY license. So those are other things, like, you know, like everything, like, to sort of take into account when you're asking for an invoice, and also when you're selecting the open access type as well. So all these things to be aware of. I think that pretty much covers it from the funder's point of view. But as Romy has said, and as we introduced at the start, we are doing the next webinar we are doing is about funders and how all of this works together.
Yeah, I think license is an important one. We should have added that, like UKI is the same as well. For licenses.
Yeah.
And then we've got an example from an institution that manages an open access fund, which some institutions have to pay for APC on behalf of their authors. And sometimes that can be managed by research administrators. But they can have different processes. So it could be that you pay directly and you get reimbursed, or the institution pays, or the administrator actually takes over once your article is accepted, or even maybe does submissions for you. And again, there can be restrictions. So we've got an example here from one of our customers in University in Lausanne in Switzerland. So for example, they don't pay for hybrid journals. So this is a hybrid journal, will not pay the APC, but they would recommend the green route. Whereas the one on the right, it's a gold journal. The estimated APC is 2,000 Swiss franc. And they will pay any APCs that are under 2,500 Swiss francs. So this passes it. So, as an author, I should be covered. And again, that is an example of how there's restrictions and it can be managed directly. Okay. as in the last webinar, we've got some resources for you. They're actually the same ones, so nothing new here. If you want more information about APCs, look at publishers' websites. You can find title lists and usually APC information or APC spreadsheets where you can check it. It might be on a journal level that you need to check it. So before you submit, there'll be a section on the journal homepage that has APC information. Sherpa Romeo is also a good tool to check about which different licenses are there. If you've got a whole list of journals to check and you don't want to be doing it through individual journal pages and scroll through it, it's like quite a nice overview. And it does also indicate if a journal pays charges an APC or not, though it doesn't state the exact amount. DOAJ does list amounts for those journals that do charge it. The best source is usually publishers' own websites because that should be the most accurate. You can also take a look at the Econos Hub Journal Finder, which pulls in information from different sources like DOAJ and Sherpa Romeo and allows you to search and also narrow it down, for example, to limit your search to only show journals with an APC under a certain threshold. But again, it's limited on what information is available in those sources. So something to be aware of. Do we want to check in if there's any questions at this point? Because I think we've kind of gone through everything we wanted to
I think
know
so.
at you.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
My mouse is not working. Oops. Well, while you're thinking of questions, just wanted to remind you of last webinar that we did 3 weeks ago, the first one in the series. It's a series of 4. This was number 2. The first one was on why should I care about open access, where we really talked about the basics of open access, archiving open access with publishing open access, different types of journals, different scenarios you might include, subscription journals, and so on. The recording of that is available on the Econos Hub website, same as the recording from today, and the slides are available as well. If you want to reuse them, feel free. The next 2 webinars that we have coming up. So on the 21st of April, we'll be talking in more detail about open access and funder requirements, which will be a very exciting hot topic. And then on the 12th of May, we'll talk about open access agreements and what that means. And we touched about all of these in the other webinars, but we thought we'd split the eyes to really deep dive into those topics for a maximum of an hour. So we don't want to take up too much of people's time.
So does anyone have any questions? There's not in the Q&A. There's not any yet.
Okay.
So everyone is feeling pretty confident about APCs.
That's good. I think this topic today was maybe a lot clearer and more straightforward. And I think than last time we went in a lot of different directions. But please join us for the next webinar on funder requirements, where we'll look in detail on some funder policies. Again, if you've got any suggestions or special requests in advance that you say, can you please dig into this policy because it confuses me, drop us a note on LinkedIn or Twitter, or send me an email. We're in the middle of prepping for that webinar already, so anything that you really want us to cover, feel free to let us know. I'm happy to take that into account, or any other comments you have on the webinars. Always happy to hear what people think.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Oh, we've got a question in the Q&A. Just one. Oh,
that's nice. Always nice to have some feedback. Your presentations are very nice and clear and comprehensive. That's why there were no questions. But thank you very much. That is always good to hear. And we've got another thank you in the chat. Well, we'll wrap it up then. We hate to keep people for longer, so it's good to get back to your work, and we'll give you 15 minutes. That's a present to you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.